Hey everyone, welcome back to the Direct to Video Connoisseur podcast. As always, this is Matt here, and I am joined once again by screenwriter and film critic, we could say, Tom Joliffe. How are you, Tom?
I'm very good, Matt. I'm pleased to be back on again.
Thank you very much. I was going to say, because the articles that you read on Flickering Myth, I don't know if that's probably the best way to describe it as film criticism.
Um, well, you can call me whatever you like. I just write
Right.
about film, so yeah,
Yeah,
I'm quite easygoing, really. Yeah,
yeah, maybe cinephile, because they're great kind of cinephile type articles.
yeah. No, that sounds good to me. Yeah, we'll go with that.
Perfect. And the film that we talked about before 2 episodes ago when you were on, or 2 episodes that you were on ago, When Darkness Falls, looks like now it's available here in the States on Peacock and Tubi for free streaming.
Yeah, yeah. It's been on just over a month on Tubi and a couple of weeks now on Peacock. So yeah, we're quite happy. We got on most of the big platforms we wanted. So it's doing quite well at the moment, particularly on Tubi. So we're really pleased with the response so far.
Yeah, and I'll say, even like for me, going to IMDb, because IMDb, it's not always perfect. Like, for example, I think IMDb says that the film we're going to be talking about today, Drive, isn't available on anything here in the States, even though it's available on Tubi as well. But I wanted to check and see, and it did say it was. But when I started typing in when and DA, it was the first thing to pop up, which is a good sign too.
Yeah, we've been not too bad really in terms of like the search relevance and results. There's a couple of films with similar titles, but I think at the moment we're kind of just edging at the top.
Yeah, and I think it's a very different movie from what we'll be talking about today, but I think it's one that everybody should check out, especially on Tubi. If here in the States, Peacock is one too. I know for anybody who has Comcast for their or Xfinity for their cable, which like we do, Xfinity essentially or Comcast essentially owns the city of Philadelphia that I live in. But one thing that I think a lot of people do have Peacock for is because they have all the Premier League games here in the U.S. So like I got a ping today because I'm an Arsenal fan that Arsenal's game was on at an hour ago. And so that's one way I think that a lot of people in America have Peacock, but also Tubi. Everybody in America can have Tubi, and so yeah, When Darkness Falls is definitely one that everybody should check out. And then also too, I think when we did the episode a little while back, I think it was in August that we did. Was it August, or maybe it was August was when we did the episode on Rothrock. So actually, it was a little bit before that, but that episode, we don't really spoil anything in it. So if you're curious to know more about the film, you can go back into the archives for that podcast episode. Yeah. Now, one of the other things, Tom, that you do is you talk about, or some of the reviews that you do, or the articles you do for Flickering Myth. One recent one that you had was about underrated action stars, which I think actually kind of works perfect for what we're going to be talking about today, because the very first one that you mentioned was Mark Dacascos.
Yeah, I've always found him just to be really sort of underrated. I think he's one of those that never quite got the break that he deserved, and a few films didn't quite catch on like they should have done. Things like Crying Freeman, which for some reason or another never got a proper release in the US. I think it eventually came around and ended up on streaming somewhere, but sort of quietly put on there somewhere. But for quite a while, it just had no US release, and that really kind of could have been a big breakout for him, I think. And it was a little bit similar with quite a few of the other ones he did sort of early on in his career.
Yeah, because you look at those years, right? If you look at 94 and 95, it's almost kind of like a sort of a double whammy in a way. It actually almost 93 as well with Only the Strong. It's like he has Only the Strong in 93 that I think did get a theatrical release in the States, and it was meant to in part introduce capoeira to American audiences, and it was a hit, but not the hit that you want. And then Double Dragon, I think he was almost like thinking this could be something he could, a franchise, based on
Yeah.
a major video game. And that movie was just completely, sauteed in the wrong sauce. I mean, it's just, it was like, didn't know if it wanted to be a kid's movie, if it wanted to be an action
Yeah,
film. And I think that really hurt him because and it seems like that happens for a lot of these guys is that they think they're going to get that big break and the movie ends up being a dud. And that's through no fault of his because he was fantastic in it. And then, like you said, Crying Freeman, which, combined with the film we're about to talk to today, I think just, two just absolutely fantastic movies. And like you said, not released here in the States, which I don't know if maybe they looked at it and thought maybe there was something too offbeat about it for American audiences. I think that's always one of those things I think that distributors, movie houses, they have a very cynical sense of what Americans are willing to watch.
yeah.
And Crying Freeman might have been a victim of that.
I can't remember exactly, but I do think there was some sort of studio politics involved. Um, issues with rights and things about getting the release in the States. So there was that kind of studio politics was holding it back slightly, and then they never sort of came around to getting a good release for it.
Yeah, because I remember for a while, I don't even think it was available on VHS here in the States. I think it was almost like, I could be wrong about that, but I thought you almost had to like get like a region-free copy or something like that.
Yeah, sort of region free, or back then I know there was a few bootlegs that used to go around of it, um, usually from sort of manga fans who would be actively seeking that film. But yeah, it just took ages. And even now that it is available on a couple of streaming platforms, from well, last I heard anyway, um, there was no big announcement or fanfare. It just came out basically and just was plonked on there and left for people to sort of discover by accident.
Yeah, I think, I mean, you think about like that. I think I it's not showing up on IMDb as being available on Tubi, but I thought it was. Maybe it was for a period of time. I think that's like finally available streaming. I think a lot of people also torrented it when torrenting became a thing. Downloading it.
Yeah,
Uh, you know,
yeah.
that was especially for American audience. I think that's how they started to get it. But it is one of those ones I think that it definitely needs that kind of nice release that has all the bells and whistles. I mean, I think for DeCascos, beyond the performance that he has in it, I think it has a special significance because he met his wife on that film as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think they got a good chemistry in the film, and obviously that did end up translating to real life. Um, it was one of those, I discovered that one and Drive pretty much within a few weeks, and that was kind of like my introduction to Dacascos. Um, I think watching on like satellite TV back in '99 or something like that, um, and I discovered one. I discovered Drive, and then my brother discovered Crying Freeman. We're both like, "Oh, you got to see this film. You got to see this guy in this film." And we're sort of cross-referencing and both discover that it's the same guy. Um, so yeah, he did stand out, I think, in amongst that pack of those kind of rising action stars at the time.
Yeah, so for me, I was introduced to him in Only the Strong. I mean, I remember that film being in the theater. Didn't have a big theatrical release, but I remember it being out, and then of course Double Dragon came soon after, and of course Double Dragon was one of those ones where it's like I think when that film finally came out, I always kind of forget that it came out in '94, and I want to say by that time most of us who had played that video game in the late '80s, we'd almost sort of like aged out of that kind of thing. Um,
Yeah,
and so then it was like, who is this movie targeted for? Because it was, I mean, I guess '94, I would have been 15. That idea of making a movie for someone who was a fan of Double Dragon, probably something R-rated would have been more in line with who was watching it at that time. But yeah, it was one of those ones that was like, okay, I accepted how good Dacascos was, but the whole thing was just so ridiculous that it was almost like I didn't really it didn't really stick. His abilities and it didn't stick. And then I guess the next one after Only the Strong and Double Dragon would have been the Crow Stairway to Heaven TV series. That's like when I next catch up with him, and I think I almost feel like that one almost, I don't say typecast him here in the States, but it was almost like this idea that he was a poor man's Brandon Lee when that really wasn't who he was. We, obviously, seeing the movie, like Drive that we're going to talk about, Crying Freeman, his skills were really fantastic on his own. I mean, he's a fantastic star on it in his own right. But I wonder in American audiences if there was a sense of like, okay, well, what are we going to do with this guy? He just looks, you know, we don't have Brandon Lee anymore, so we're going to use Dacascos or something. I'm not sure exactly what it was.
Yeah, I mean, I think there were elements of that. I think it's just one of those things. I mean, if you have success in like a syndicated show, that can take you quite a way as well. And then obviously, The Crow, I think it was just one season in the end, so he didn't have much luck on TV either. I think the thing with Double Dragon, that was right at the beginning of the whole video game, the sort of video game movie thing, before it kind of went on this long run of people making these films that were never really that good. So they were sort of testing the waters along with the Super Mario Brothers film, and there was often very weird crosses in tones and things like that, like you said. But I do think one thing that Sheldon Lettich said was because Dacascos was off filming Double Dragon around about the time that they were pushing Only the Strong, he wasn't available for sort of promotion and things like that, so he couldn't really put his face out there and connect it with the film, which sort of had a detrimental effect on Only the Strong. So he's kind of off doing Double Dragon. He's got no fault of his own really, but he's got to kind of leave Only the Strong behind, and then that kind of affects the opening sort of box office a little bit. And then obviously Double Dragon doesn't work out either, so it's a little bit unfortunate, really.
Yeah, that's interesting because right when we were talking about Cynthia Rothrock, it was a similar thing where like she was, making the Golden Harvest films, and then she talks to Stallone about this opportunity to make a movie with him, and so she kind of gets out of that contract with Golden Harvest, and she probably was turning down. I mean, I would have to think she was turning down potential projects with like maybe like a PM or somebody like that because she only did the one with them. And of course, that film never works out, and so then it's sort of like you said, has that knock-on effect of she doesn't do the movie with Stallone that would have been the break for her, but she also doesn't do anything else to in that sense. And I think you're right because Only the Strong was one that like action fans all kind of know. Like I remember being on TV a lot, but you're right that like it it didn't have like the Cascos out there, um, you know, selling it. And I never really put those two together. The reason why he wasn't out there selling is he was doing Double Dragon, which of course, yeah, didn't end up working out. So yeah, it's interesting how that sort of so even like Only the Strong sort of had a knock on the Double Dragon sort of had a knock on effect on Only the Strong, and maybe too with Crying Freeman that because Double Dragon didn't do as well, there wasn't an impetus to have more Mark Dacascos films in America, and if they thought Crying Freeman was too off for American audiences, they weren't going to bother with it.
Yeah, I think that's certainly the case. I think if you start early and you start off with a flop, I guess it's difficult to kind of recover from that. And something like Double Dragon kind of, I'm not even sure if it went theatrical in the end. It might have done in the States, but I think in the UK it went straight to video. Um, and given they probably spent a reasonable amount of money on it, they were probably intending it, for it to be a bit bigger a release, really.
Yeah, I mean, according to IMDb, it had a budget of about 7.8 million, which actually for a 90s attempt at a blockbuster, that's not a lot, but it's also, from 90s, money standpoint, it's more. But yeah, it grossed 2.3 million worldwide, so it didn't even make a third of its budget back. So, that's it right there. But also too, I think the plan with a movie like that is that that's going to be the first of many Double Dragon movies that will be in the theater. And so when it's a dud like that, that's it. Kind of just kills the whole thing. And you're right. Like I think it sort of put it in a place where Dacascos, I think he was riding on that. I guess his manager had pushed that as the big one for him, and it didn't work. I mean, I think another one you know, think of who's unsung, thinking of Gary Daniels. I think in his case it was Fist of the North Star that he had, you know, put all his eggs in that basket. It didn't work out, and I think it wasn't the movie he thought it was going to be too. When it was probably the same thing with Double Dragon. I'm sure, you know, I wonder if Dacascos was expecting that to be something along the lines of you know, Only the Strong or some of the other, you know, action films that he'd done. And when it turns out it's not that, you know, you probably see the picture on the screen and think, oh boy, this is, you know, we're in trouble.
Yeah, I think, you know, that's quite common in the movie business. Um, it was just an interesting time with, you know, the sort of manga adaptations and all these video games, and they kind of have certain similarities as well. And nothing was quite working really. So I think when Super Mario Brothers sort of bombed a little bit, that probably put a lot of this, you know, the studios on edge. So maybe the studio behind Double Dragon probably held back a little bit and thought, well, maybe we don't want to release it on quite so many screens. We'll just keep it a little bit smaller and see how we do. It almost
Yeah,
becomes like damage limitation.
right, right. And it's interesting because if you think of, you look at, you know, in the early 2000s, right, we get the first Resident Evil movie with Mila Jovovich and Michelle Rodriguez, and that movie is an R-rated movie. And it's almost like, I guess it maybe took these movies for like, and then I guess maybe too, the other thing, I guess, you know, I never really thought of before, but the people making these video game movies, they probably would have been like older, you know, maybe older baby boomers who just understand video games as something kids play and didn't really
Yeah.
think about the fact that yes, they started out as things for kids because that's when they were first made, but those kids got older and still were interested in the games or still interested in the ideas and the stories, and so they could market these video game based movies to adults. And you know, not that, you know, Resident Evil is like the greatest thing, but it definitely from an action franchise. I mean, it definitely did much better than Double Dragon. I mean, they managed to get multiple films out of it, and I think that's what they were expecting Double Dragon to be. Had they made Double Dragon maybe an R-rated movie with Dacascos just sort of unleashed as an action star, maybe, you know, you don't get Scott Wolf as the other, but maybe another, you know, martial artist to play the other part. I think, you know, maybe they would have had something there, but instead, yeah, it was, you know, completely marketed and made the wrong way. But that seemed to be a thing in the '90s with video game movies, comic book movies. It just seemed like there's this idea of like, who do we market these things to? And it's almost like, you know, the studio's got a better sense of it as the 2000s went on, that let's like make these movies for adults, and if kids are able to watch them, that's fine. But you know, unfortunately for Dacascos, right, you know, he came out at an age when that wasn't, you know, Mila Jovovich, you know, she's, you know, maybe 10 years younger than him, and she gets the benefit of coming around at a time when Hollywood had kind of figured it out.
Yeah, and I think, you know, by then video games had been a little bit more sophisticated, and you had sort of, you had the little, you know, movie snippets and openings and FMVs in the video games, so they almost translate a little bit better to cinema. I know that, you know, her film pretty much ignored the original game, but you know, everyone was kind of intrigued. I don't know if you remember the original Resident Evil. There was like quite a cinematic opening on it, so that always had a sense that it could translate well to a film, and I think that's what brought people in, got them quite interested in the film.
Yeah, because I think that was one of the first ones to really like. I think that one, maybe Grand Theft Auto 3, they were some of the first ones to really take advantage of what the PlayStation 2 could do.
Yeah, yeah, I think so. I mean, and it's easier to kind of translate those kind of ideas and those visuals to a film than it is, you know, like a 2D, you know, Super Mario game.
Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting because Double Dragon, right? You feel like Double Dragon should have been a no-brainer because they could have just remade the Warriors, and you know, and I think it would have worked in that sense. But they were like, well, no, it's a kids game. Which, to be honest, like thinking about it as a kids game, I mean, I remember playing it. I mean, I'm like picking up baseball bats and whips and smacking people with them and everything. It wasn't like it was that nice of a game. So it you know, maybe that was the other part of it too. Is maybe they didn't, you know, they didn't know how to manage that. That, you know, that they didn't know understand the game enough, and know that it wasn't probably going to be something you could make for kids. But yeah, Super Mario is another one where it was like that game is just sort of so all over the place. I mean, he eats mushrooms and gets bigger. It's yeah. How do you make that into a game that works when it's so surreal and so many it's almost like trying to make Alice in Wonderland or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, in both cases, they kind of have to take big liberties and try and make a film. I guess they went for the quirky route, and there was quite a lot of films during that era that was sort of weird and quirky and kind of like futuristic. Adaptations like Johnny Mnemonic and Tank Girl and things like that. They always have this sort of similarities of bright colors and very strange mixes in tone and design.
Yeah, because that's one Tank Girl's always been one of my favorite comic book adaptations. But I think when I looked at the IMDb trivia, I think Lori Petty wanted nothing to do with it. She wanted to distance herself from it. And there are some weird things. Though we have Iggy Pop as like, what was he like some kind of animal hybrid person thing. There's all kinds of interesting things going on in that movie. Or maybe I'm thinking of Ice-T was the animal hybrid person, and Iggy Pop was maybe yeah.
Yeah, I know Ice-T was, yeah.
Yeah.
And he played a sort of similar character in that he did in Johnny Mnemonic as well.
Yeah, and you make a great point too, because in the '90s there was that there were a lot of kind of big movies. It was almost like I think there was a sense, even like the Batman movies. Thinking about what those looked like at that time with Joel Schumacher. It's like you have like Batman Returns in '93 that is sort of Tim Burton's last film of that, and it's like really dark. You've got the Penguin with his like really dark look to him, and anytime there's any color in it, it's really just meant to be a strong contrast to the darkness that's there. And then you get that next film where it's like even like the Two-Face that you have with Tommy Lee Jones, where the side that's supposed to be disfigured is all like pink and colorful. And the Riddler is a very colorful character as well, and it's a very different kind of movie compared to what we had seen before that. And I think I never really thought of that before, that you kind of, yeah, all of those. I mean, Batman Forever is another one, thinking about like with Batman and Robin, where you've got like Poison Ivy is this bright green, and Mr. Freeze is this bright light blue color. But yeah, movies sort of had that kind of vibe to them, and it's I guess it took getting into the 2000s, and they started to transition into different kind of comic book movies. And I guess the video game movie followed suit, or it was in the same vein.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's just one of those things where you get these trends, and they seem to sort of drift through the movie industry. It just seems weird that it was all these films that never quite managed to find an audience. Aside from the Batman films, obviously they did a little bit better, but they just couldn't really capture a whole audience. I think they were trying to put too much into it, too much color, too much everything, too many ideas, and they were a little bit messy. But I guess in time, that's almost become a little bit more popular, that kind of film, and lots of color again. So people look back and they kind of reappraise things like Johnny Mnemonic and Tank Girl. And I know that Super Mario Brothers is a bit of a cult film now as well.
Yeah, and I wonder too. I don't know if this is something that ever comes up. I guess for you when you're writing the screenplays, the movies themselves, like when they're making the movies, that's a different part of it. But I know one of the trends in filmmaking has been to make the films like less colorful and kind of more like sort of this sort of washed out, sort of like, I don't know if gray is the right term, but sort of like a darker feel, because but and I don't know if this is the same in England, but here in the United States, TV advertising, they kind of use the digital spectrum to just make these really bright, colorful things. And it's almost like filmmakers don't want anything to do with bright, colorful advertising. And it is interesting to see that maybe some filmmakers are starting to go back and say like, okay, it doesn't really matter what advertisers are doing in America. I'm just going to make my movie and not try to be so above that, or just make the movie I want to make.
Yeah, I do think there's an element of that. Yeah. There's a few trends at the moment. So very sort of colourful films are kind of back in again, but then you've also got those sort of films and TV shows that are quite as you say, quite dark, and not even necessarily just dark. It's more like they sort of lower the contrast, and it's, you know, the brightness, and it's a little bit dim. Um, and that seems to be a bit of a weird trend, really, where everything looks, yeah, like a little bit grey and a little bit, you know, flat. So I would prefer a bit more colour myself than just having kind of like one tone.
Yeah, because yeah, I read an article about this recently because they released a new Dexter series, or I guess they kind of brought Dexter back, and they were comparing what Dexter looks like now, in the version now versus what they had made in the late 2000s, and the contrast of how much brighter that Dexter was compared to this one. And yeah, I mean, I guess part of it is they want the film to have the same lighting. I guess it's easier to edit it if it's all the same. But there is that pull. I mean, I think just in contrasting, I think of the film that you made, When Darkness Falls, the one that we talked about before. That one is very kind of open and lit, especially in the daytime scenes, and it makes for a really fantastic contrast for when the night scenes come. It has a really great effect there, and so I think the more filmmakers start to do that, I think it can really, really open the film up and give it vibes that that it could definitely use.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that was something that we were quite keen to do, because I think sometimes it's in the post-production process with grading and things like that, that sometimes it goes a little bit too far. And I think, you know, sometimes you can just take everything a little bit too much, you know, into this sort of flat space where it's almost, yeah, everything's a little bit kind of monotone, monochrome. Um, and you know, they seem to take a lot of shadow out as well, so you don't get so much of that kind of noirish lighting anymore, where, you know, someone can have half their face in shadow. They sort of want to get everything a little bit faded in shadow.
Yeah, yeah, it's an interesting thing. I was talking with Ty have come up with reviews about the Bruce Willis movies, and we were joking that maybe like they are able to use that sort of that coloring thing to be able to kind of those grading techniques to be able to just splice Bruce Willis into scenes if he isn't shooting at the same time, that like, okay, he's talking to Leon in one film and they're sitting next to each other, that they can kind of use that old technique of when somebody's talking to themselves or something, in an old TV show. But using the grading technique, you don't even notice that you're using grading as a tool. You don't even notice that they were shot at two different times, that they're just put in together. And I guess that's part of it with the low budget films. It's a great way to, I guess, you know, uh, make do with certain budgetary constraints. But it is, from a film standpoint, and seeing it in so much, or with TV, where especially nowadays, because TV seems to be the medium where people are taking more chances. It seems like movies are the big tent projects, and TV are the ones that have like the limited audiences, or they're made for a smaller potential audience. That you're seeing it seems like it's more there. But yeah, it is interesting now that, like you said, that especially with advancements and things like Blu-ray, that some of these movies are being looked at again. And I mean, even Double Dragon's one has been looked at again. I don't think anybody's been able to been able to like make a case for it, which I think is probably a good thing. But I mean, I think the case that they make for it is DeCascos is great martial arts in it.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those. I think he's always come off quite well in that one, as the stronger of the two leads. I mean, Scott Wolf was kind of like the bigger name back then from a lot of the stuff he'd done in TV, but he's just not suited to the role, and I think it was just miscast, you know, purely to kind of cash in on his fame at the time. But I do know that, you know, people do consider it an enjoyable kind of so bad it's good kind of film now.
Yeah, I think that's definitely the case. And it's funny too with Scott Wolf. He's another one that you think about. Maybe he came along 10 years too early, because now it seems like a lot of male leads who played his kind of male lead on a TV show, they're now, they kind of just sort of slap a beard on them and have them grimace or snarl some and give them these sort of action leads and do the kind of the Born Identity trick, right? Where you can splice the film up and make it look like they know, a lot of great martial arts, and they're an action league, and they kind of walk around with their gun and whatever. Like I think you look at Jesse Metcalf or Ryan Phillippe or some of those stars. That almost like it's kind of funny to imagine him in a similar role, maybe in a Bruce Willis film or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, he probably could have done. I think I think it might have been one of the recent Bruce Willis films that had uh, Zach Morris from
Yeah,
Saved by the Bell.
right, Precious Cargo.
That was
Yeah.
Mark Paul Gosselaar. That's his name. Yeah.
Yeah. Right, and it just seems to be this idea of like just give them a beard and have them. I mean, at least Mark Paul Gosselaar's was a little bit of a roguish thief kind of character at the beginning of the movie, but then as the movie goes on, he just becomes too grizzled and too angry, and he's just grimacing and snarling the whole time with his beard, and that's the character he plays. And yeah, it just seems like they just kind of do that with all of these ones, and so I think that's another thing too, as we talk about Dacascos a little bit more, is that I think it's another area where Dacascos loses out a bit, is that there's a mindset of, well, why would we have this guy Dacascos, who people only really maybe, like in the States, people probably only know him from the Iron Chef America show that he was the host on. They don't, know him beyond that. And it's like, well, why would we get him when everybody knows, Jesse Metcalf from, whatever movies that he did, or whoever, whatever the actor is, Mark Paul Gosselaar, right? Everybody knows him from Saved by the Bell. We'll put him on the cover, and we can edit it enough to make him look the part of an action lead. And it's almost like, yeah, we don't get enough of Dacascos, which, and maybe too from Dacascos' mindset, he doesn't want to do these movies where there probably isn't a great action director, or there isn't even a action director, and the martial arts are probably not as great. He might have to even choreograph the whole thing. So, but I almost kind of feel like he loses out a bit again as a result of that trend in direct to video.
Yeah, I think so. Sometimes it's a little bit difficult, I think, for casting agents to sort of pinpoint where you would put him as well. He's not the sort of conventional hero type, because I think he's got a bit more of a kind of vulnerability than your standard, like a Bruce Willis or Steven Seagal type of role. And they tend to be this sort of, rugged and stern, kind of very stoic roles where they're playing off that Clint Eastwood archetype. And that tends to be what most kind of action leading roles tend to be now, or they're a bit kind of snarky and sarcastic. And maybe the sort of casting agents don't really think of him in that way. And again, maybe not intense enough as a villain.
Yeah, I mean, there's an earnestness to his performances that I think you're right. Like it's hard to do like grizzled. I think the closest I think was One Night in Bangkok that he did with Chaos.
Yeah.
And the fascinating thing about that role for me wasn't just that he plays sort of this. You're right. Like even though he's playing this sort of darker, like out for revenge character, there is the vulnerability there that like he kind of makes the part a little bit deeper than just him out there, getting revenge. That he's doing it for a reason, and he has a sort of an emotional sensibility to him that's a little different, which I think is why Chaos likes to work with him, because he likes heroes like that. But you're right; it's like a little bit different than what what people try to sell in American audiences. And and again, like from a villain standpoint too, it's like he's almost like too likable, that when he plays a villain, I mean, he plays a great villain. I think he plays a great baddie, but
Yeah, he does. Yeah.
yeah, there's almost something sympathetic about him that you almost don't want to see him as a baddie or something like that.
Yeah, I think, because he's got those interesting aspects to how he is as a performer. And I think that probably stems from how he is as a person as well. I think it's just he's an interesting performer in this genre, and I don't think he's necessarily always given the chance to show that. It's one of those things where studios just want, maybe they just want certain archetypes, and he doesn't quite fit into those.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point too. I mean, one of the interesting things too is in going back um, to One Night in Bangkok, thinking about not, the archetype kind of thing. he's playing a character that's 10 years older than him, when most action leads that we see now are older than DeCascos, playing people that are maybe 10 years younger in the films. And even just that idea that I'm going to play somebody who's older and sort of get into the character that way, it's not really something that filmmakers, like you said, that when they're making, especially direct to video action film, they want sort of the rugged lead who can just get in there and just be this rugged lead who, he's going to be younger. I mean, I think Frank Grillo is another one who's like about 3 years younger than him, who's starting to get more roles in direct to video. And I don't think he has anywhere near like the level of skill that DeCascos does. But I think from a direct to video marketing standpoint, they feel like Grillo is someone they can slap on the cover and get the sort of the feel that they want as his lead. Whereas DeCascos is going to be maybe doing these more introspective parts with someone like Chaos. And again, they American distributors don't know how to market those kinds of films, I think.
Yeah, I think that's it, really. I mean, those are the kind of characters I would find more interesting for myself. I think maybe that's why he's always done a little bit better in Europe, and occasionally in Asia as well. He's never really quite taken off in the UK, but I think it's because we tend to sort of follow American trends to some extent.
Yeah. I mean, that's an interesting thing. I always think about like the difference between like Westerns in America versus Westerns in Europe, where it seems like a lot of European, like the Europeans like the idea of the Western as being this almost like this vast, like uncivilized space, because they've been living in civilization in Europe for so many, for centuries, that this idea that there's this sort of untamed space out there, that they want to sort of relish it, and they have heroes that sort of come out of this untamed space and are more like they're less one note, and they're kind of more introspective in some ways, where there's not always the black and white, whereas the American Western was always like this sort of black and white, like they're taming the lawlessness in a way, that you get these heroes, these sort of grizzled heroes like Chuck Connor, the rifleman, those kind of characters that come in and just sort of tame everything and make everything ordered and right. And I think that's one of the things about DeCascos, is he doesn't come into a movie as someone who's ordered and right. He comes into a movie as someone who's more introspective, who, like you said, has vulnerabilities that I think you're right. It might play better in Europe than in America, where everybody wants this sort of black and white which, again, I say everybody in America. I think part of it is, I think, again, distributors always have this sort of cynical sense of what Americans will watch. And it'd be interesting, if we're given the chance, what we would actually watch or not watch.
Yeah, I think that's the case, really. I think he's just got this kind of everyman quality and this kind of enigmatic side that it makes him kind of interesting to watch, but he's never really had the wide audience he kind of deserves to do that. And when he's had slightly bigger films like Cradle to the Grave, where he played the villain, he's kind of given a very kind of two-dimensional villain to play in that. Yeah. So he doesn't really get the chance to shine that much.
Yeah, and I think, as we sort of transition to the film we're going to talk about here, Drive, which is, I think, just talking about his movies, I think this one, for me, it's right up there with Crying Freeman. Though it's interesting, because I looked at my review of it, and I wasn't as high on it as I was, watching it again for our conversation. And I wonder if maybe I just been watching too much, or maybe I wasn't paying attention, because, the martial arts skill is just there on a different level. And again, I wonder if there's a sense that American audiences don't like that kind of that theatrical spectacle of martial arts, and that we'd rather just, I guess, somebody shooting a bunch of people or something. But the visuals and the quality that the DeCascos brings to this role is such like another level, that it is kind of a shame that he didn't get to do this, and maybe it isn't a shame, because maybe Hollywood would have dumbed it down or something like that.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the film was a little bit ahead of its time, really. I think in terms of what it did in bringing Hong Kong style fights to American cinema, it was ahead of Rush Hour, and even Rush Hour was kind of watered down compared to what Jackie Chan would normally do in Hong Kong. So there was just this sense that it was maybe a little bit too soon. And then again, they had problems with, producers and distributors that kind of affected the release, and it didn't really get the platforms it deserved, which is a shame. It should have had a wider audience, and I think there was a lot of potential for. Although they were very kind of keen to do a sequel at the time, but it just never came about. Getting delayed and never really got off the ground.
Yeah, and I can see too from Dacascos' standpoint that this is a movie that he probably looks at in contrast to Double Dragon and says, wow, this is like amazing. Like we did it. We did everything we set out to do in this film. And it looks like it only got theatrical releases, I think, in Japan and the Philippines. And, probably that deflation, that sort of deflating feeling of realizing like this isn't going to get released theatrically in the US. I don't know in the late 90s, I start to think because, we were still at a point there. I think Titanic hadn't really, at least in America, hadn't turned the film industry into this search for more big tent project. I think you still could have gotten a movie like this, a theatrical release in America, and had it, had audiences want to see it. But, I think for him, I have to imagine he was excited about what this, because you watch it and there's no way to not look at it and think like this is going to be a huge hit, but then it doesn't get the release. And I guess also too, thinking about what was big at that time. Con Air is another movie that was huge at that time, and this is so different from a Con Air that was in the theater.
Yeah, definitely. I think part of it maybe was that when they were making it, the producers probably just had in mind, right, this is going to be an HBO special or something like that. So they probably weren't thinking of a wider kind of release and being broader. They were probably just happy to some extent let the director kind of get on with it. And I think between director Steve Wang and the kind of, I think the Alpha Stunt team they were called, they were kind of infamous at the time for working on Power Rangers and a few other things. And they really kind of exceeded probably what they set out to do, because I think it is a low budget film, and what they deliver is really good for the budget, and they just seem to nail every element. So as well as the action being really sort of amazing and way ahead of its time in an American sense, they nail the sort of the buddy cop side of it as well, the comedy.
Yeah, it had a lot of those elements, and I think you're right. I think you're right. From a budget standpoint, this is very sort of like, it's all kind of, I don't want to say self-contained, but it doesn't have a lot of, locations. I think probably the biggest pieces, I think that big, huge sets that they use for the nightclub at the end of the movie, I think may have been probably their biggest set that they used. And then they had, the garage, and they had the boat, so they had a few different places, but that was kind of like the big one. So from a financial standpoint, you're right, it wasn't quite as big. And I think the explosions, I think, were things they could do with models and to sort of save the price on them. Though they, like you said, that for the budget, I think, it looked at. I think you said too with the Alpha Stunt team, I think they were so good that I think when they're making their own movie, which I think this kind of was more their own movie, it's almost like another movie that wanted to use them probably would have had to spend a lot more to get them in the film.
Yeah, no, I think so. Yeah. And they had quite a tight shooting schedule as well. So I know that they did a lot where they would shoot in 2 units sort of simultaneously, just so they could get the film made in a really tight schedule. I don't know what version you saw. Do you know if you saw the director's cut or the theatrical cut?
So the version that I watched for this was on Tubi, which is the theatrical cut. But then I think the one that I watched when I reviewed it for the site was the direct. I think the director's cut had been out by then. This was what was it, 10 years ago that I reviewed it? Yeah, about 10, 12 years ago. I thought it was the director, but maybe it wasn't. Maybe even that one was also the theatrical version.
Yeah, I know the director isn't a big fan of the theatrical cut, because they literally strip away every sort of extra level of character to in terms of motivation for Dacascos' character. So in the director's cut, he's got a lot more motivation in what he's doing. And they changed the score around as well completely. So I think in the theatrical cut, they had this kind of a little bit of like a techno-y kind of score that was a little bit slightly jarring, where I think in the director's cut, they replaced it with something that felt a little bit more impressive and actually fit the moments within the action a lot more.
Yeah, so definitely when I originally watched it, I think it was the director's cut, because I do remember that techno score a little bit more heavily, and it also the length seems to fit. Like I remember it being, I think, closer to 2 hours when I watched it for that review, and you could hear like there were a couple bits of like that techno music in there, but you're right, and I guess maybe too, getting back to what we talked about with Dacascos and his sort of like that quality that he has to bring some depth to a role that American distributors don't know what to do with, perhaps, that makes the movie, like you said, gives the movie a little bit more depth. And I guess too, there is that mindset of like length was still a concern. I think that obviously this is well before Netflix, where now Netflix puts out a 2-hour action movie all the time. But at that time, especially if it's not going to be, even theatrical releases, I think when I watched Batman Returns recently, that was like just around 2 hours. So even theatrical releases were you'd be lucky if they were that long. So then to think of something that wasn't going to be released theatrically, they probably wanted to get it closer to like, it ended up being a 145.
Yeah, I mean, that would have been it really. They sort of take out everything that they think they can afford to lose, really, which is a shame. And there's only really 3 or 4 of these kind of moments, but there's one particular scene where Dacascos is kind of laying out everything that's happened to him to Kadeem Hardison, where just sort of prior to the final scene, so they're in the car and they're on the way to basically the final kind of action scene, and it's like a little confessional scene where he's really good in it, and basically that got cut out. So it's a shame really, because that would have added just that extra touch to the film, I think, in terms of like emotional involvement.
Yeah, for sure. And I think also too, maybe for Dacascos, I know one of the things I think in watching Scott Adkins's YouTube series, where he talks to other action leads, that these action leads really like to be able to show that they can actually act as well as do the martial arts piece. And so then to have the scene where Dacascos is really showing that he can act and play that part well, to have it completely be cut out, I think probably was deflating for him as well.
Yeah, I think it is. I think I listened to the commentary as well on the DVD edition I've got. And I think, they did mention that while they were sort of looking over the scene. It was, it's one of those things, you always get things cut out that you don't really want.
Yeah.
When you're an actor or you're a director, writer.
Yeah, and maybe right here we can maybe do a quick sort of synopsis to give people a sense. I think most people listening to this episode have watched this movie, but anybody who hasn't, this is definitely one you've got to see. And the synopsis standpoint, we get Dacascos' character is Toby Wong. He's from Hong Kong. He sort of shows up on a boat, which it's supposed to be in San Francisco, but I believe it's San Pedro in LA. But he gets off the boat and he's attacked by John Piper Ferguson and his men, and he sort of takes them down on the boat, escapes in the water, and the next thing you know, he's in a bar where he sees Kadeem Hardison, and John Piper Ferguson's men attack them there, and that's where he's sort of, in a way, kidnaps Kadeem Hardison, makes him drive him, the idea of driving him to LA. And then as the film unravels, or as the film sort of goes on, we get a sense that, okay, Dacascos' character, he was implanted with something, with a device when when China took over Hong Kong in the late 90s. The Chinese government implanted a device that's supposed to make him sort of stronger and better equipped to be a fighter. But he's escaped, and he's going to sell this device that's implanted in him to a tech company in Los Angeles. So he just needs to get there to sell the device. And of course, the Chinese government wants it back, so they hire John Piper Ferguson to get the device back. And then at the same time, you've got Kadeem Hardison, who's being forced at first to drive the Cascos, but then he sort of, likes the Cascos, and he also likes the idea of getting part of the money that the Cascos is going to get for selling the device. So they kind of make their way down to California to LA. They make a stop with Brittany Murphy, who at that time, I think she had done Clueless, I guess, at that point, but she was, I think, someone who was also trying to kind of find her way and getting parts. But she plays this sort of kooky hotel owner who has a thing for Kadeem Hardison, and she helps the two of them out. But then, of course, the people chasing them find them there, blow up her hotel, and then she sort of directs them to go to this club to get a car that they can take all the way to LA. And at that time, the Chinese government has sent another model, who's a advanced model, to go and confront the Cascos. And that's where they sort of have the big confrontation there in this nightclub, where the movie essentially ends. So there's a little bit that comes after, but that's sort of like the big finale. But throughout the film, you kind of got a situation where every like 10 minutes or so, you have some kind of solid action scene with the Cascos using his martial arts against a whole host of baddies. That just, I think that there really isn't a lot of downtime in this film, I guess, is probably the best way to look at it. I think even the director's cut didn't have a lot. And so, yeah, this is definitely, I think it might be my favorite Dacascos movie, this one or Crying Freeman.
Yeah, I'm very much the same. I'm kind of between the two in terms of what my favorite is. I just think, this is, it's such a lot of fun. I think what they've done is they deliver everything, perfectly. So the action is great. There's not many films that have come out in America since that have, matched this for action. And I know that Scott Adkins is a big fan of it. He's one of the few that can kind of create fight scenes in his films that kind of come close. But I think, what really makes it work is there's a really good chemistry between Dacascos and Kadeem Hardison. And then when Brittany Murphy comes into the film as well, she has a really good kind of chemistry with those two as well. I think it all links together quite well.
Yeah, and I think even like the Brittany Murphy character, watching that, I think that's another thing with like distributors in Hollywood. They wouldn't know what to do with that character, that she's off the wall as opposed to just being like this sort of, in most action movies, a Brittany Murphy character comes in and she's just there to be like this sort of sexy, love interest for the main character. And I think with Dacascos' character, sort of, again, like we don't get it in the theatrical cut, but he's not someone that's going to be looking for a romantic lead at that, romantic love interest at that time. So it wouldn't have worked in that capacity. But then also with Kadeem Hardison's character, with him being more offbeat, it needed her to be more offbeat. But I think, again, it's so non-traditional that I was watching it and I was like, yeah, I kind of get, like, again, why distributors and wouldn't have been on board with this. They would have just been like, this is too weird for us. Whereas I thought it was another fun element of the film that made it work.
Yeah, very much so. It's one of those things where, distributors, if they see something written down or they see something on the final product that's a little bit off center or different to what is normally expected, they get a little bit edgy, I guess, in terms of, is this going to work for our audience? Do they just want something that's kind of routine? Like you say, maybe just the more generic kind of female working at the motel, and she's just a bit more like wallpaper, really.
Right, and they just have the sort of the love scene in the hotel room, like he, I mean, it's kind of funny thinking about like the juxtaposition that there's a scene in the film where Dacascos' character is sleeping, and Brittany Murphy goes in to try to wake him up because her mindset is that, okay, these two guys have come here so she can kind of party with them and hang out with them while they're there, and Kadeem Hardison's character is working on his car, so now she wants to interact with Dacascos, but he's sleeping the whole time. And it's sort of like this great juxtaposition from like what we usually see in those romantic movies where the main character's sleeping, he's probably shirtless, and then the woman walks in something, very, very skimpy or something, and sort of wakes him up, and then maybe cue the saxophone music, and they start the love scene. And this was the complete opposite, where she's trying to wake him. She's like trying to dump water on him. There's some ridiculous movie playing with like a frog with an enhanced brain playing on the TV set, and then the baddies show up, and we get this really fantastic action scene that is just absolutely just inside this little small hotel room with Brittany Murphy and Dacascos, and then John Piper Ferguson and his baddies. It was really, really fantastic. It was just something that was just absolutely. And again, it just kind of completely, it gives you something completely different from what we expect in these action movies.
Yeah, for sure. I think each set piece has its own unique sort of flavor, and they use every setting that they've got really, really interestingly. So you've got the very tight kind of motel room sequence where it's very kind of frantic, and he's using the mattress to block them off. He's bouncing off the beds to kind of, dodge bullets and shoot them back. And then you've got this kind of frantic scene in the main room where he's using pots and pans, and they've got these kind of sort of electric nightsticks. So at one point he has to take his boots off and put them on his hands. It's just really imaginative. I think it's got that kind of the kind of quality that you would get in Hong Kong, where the action is really thought out very well, like a kind of, chaotic kind of dance. So they're clearly very inspired by that. But given the time they had, I think it's really impressive with what they came out with.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think you make a great point with the inspired piece. I mean, I think you even see it like right away in that very first fight on the boat, where he's just, sort of, jumping around and sort of, using everything at his disposal. And that sort of that inspired mindset. I mean, I was watching City Hunter, the Jackie Chan movie with, Norton and Gary Daniels, or Richard Norton, Gary Daniels. And I mean, that was one that was made in Hong Kong. And you see almost a similar mindset. Of course, that was done on a much bigger budget, much bigger scale. But, the cadence of the fight scenes, and like you said, the ability to sort of use everything and just think of like what would we do for a scene there. Even just thinking about Jackie Chan in that, where he's the two women throw him nightsticks so he can fight off Richard Norton using the batons that he's wielding. And it's almost like kind of the same thing, the way Dacascos takes those boots and puts them on his hands and uses them to block the nightsticks. And then he sees that they're kind of melted, right? And he has to throw them aside. It was really,
Yeah.
I mean, it was one of those things too with his character, where they even, Piper Ferguson's character even mentions it, like, hey, he's going to take your guns off you and use them against you. And it's like this thing where he's never really armed, but he's able to use what he has to fend off these bad guys. And again, they use the technique of having all the baddies sort of have masks on, so that they can probably cycle through a lot of the alpha stunt team and have them in different parts. But it's like every fight is just so inspired, and the fact that seeing how much Dacascos was up to the task, I think was just so. I think, like you said, I mean, he's so underrated that he isn't getting more roles when you see him in something like this.
Yeah, exactly. Because I mean, he's performing most of the sort of stunts and things himself, and his physical prowess at that time was kind of unique. I think his mixed of kind of like gymnastics and his martial arts. So I mean, there's a moment where he kind of flips over these railings on a sort of a level on the first floor of this kind of outside balcony, and then sort of does a back somersault off that onto the floor, sort of 10 feet below. So he does it at sort of the drop of a hat, as if it's nothing.
Yeah, and also too, I mean, we the scenes that he does with Kadeem Hardison, where again, we take for granted nowadays that a Kadeem Hardison is in a movie like this, and the editors are going to use split-second cuts to mitigate his perhaps inability to work in the action sphere. And they didn't really have that here. So it's really just DeCascos sort of propping him up. And I think the same thing with the scenes with Brittany Murphy, where it's almost like he's carrying them through the action scenes to make them as spectacular as they were.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, they really play to his strengths in that, and they always kind of keep a sort of comical tone within the action as well. So they always remember that kind of blending of comedy with the action, and I think that makes those set pieces more interesting. And you know, later on, you've got these sequences that get kind of really wild with the kind of stunt bikes that burst in through the nightclub. It doesn't make a hell of a lot of sense, but you know, much like all the sort of Hong Kong films, it doesn't really need to. It's part of this whole kind of, you know, crazy action film. And you know, again, maybe that's part of the thing that didn't really, the producers weren't really too keen on. So maybe they thought, oh, this is a little bit too kind of over the top.
Yeah, and I wonder too, you know, when you mentioned that part of it, the potentially being too over the top, you know, I wonder too, with a lot of the people that would have been making those decisions at that time, they probably would have been people who came up in the 70s with a lot of the grindhouse films where you've got like, Italian based films, movies like The Warriors, where there was almost like an everything but the kitchen sink approach, where it's just the main character walks into this area of kind of like destroyed Brooklyn or the Bronx, and there's just these gangs that are just kind of in these really outlandish costumes. And again, somebody in a dirt bike would be completely at home in a situation like that. And I wonder if they kind of had a they kind of saw all of that as crass, and anything that maybe harkened back to that, they maybe thought the same thing, like, well, this is just like these Italian grindhouse films that I watched in the 70s, like this, why is this dirt bike here? That just, there's no point in that, or something like that.
Yeah, I think it's just one of those things, really. They obviously kind of left the production to it. It's one of those things where they just say, right, as long as you get it done in time, do what you like. But then when it comes to sort of screening the rough cut, they're probably thinking, oh, this is going to be quite difficult to really sell. Whereas really, it shouldn't be. It should make it more of a marketable film, I think, to be that kind of wild.
Yeah, and I do wonder, like, with this idea of like, okay, we don't know what American audiences would go for, what they would like. I mean, seeing DeCascos, the sort of electric martial arts that he brings to this role, it's almost like the very first scene you see it, and it's like it kind of draws you in right away. Or I mean, I don't know how it can't draw you in right away when you first see it from that first scene. And like each successive scene is going to probably, I mean, they do that job of building on each successive scene, so that like that first one is just the start. It's hard to imagine somebody, but I guess, maybe they look at it and say, well, no, this is what American audiences don't like, this martial arts stuff. They like, I don't know if that was I don't know what the mindset would be, but it's hard not to be drawn in when it starts like that.
Yeah, I guess maybe they, in a very kind of, simplistic way, they probably thought, well, martial art films are on the way down. Seagal's not making money anymore. Van Damme's not making as much money. It already hasn't quite worked with DeCascos, so it might have been in their mindset that, they didn't really want to push it beyond maybe HBO level and, things like that. So maybe they should have had a bit more faith in it, or, in hindsight, maybe someone should have taken that chance that obviously, a year later they were taking a chance on Jackie Chan and bringing that kind of action into American cinema. And then obviously a year later, you've got Yuen Woo-ping. He comes in and does, the fight choreography for The Matrix. So, by then it becomes in vogue.
Right, because when we get to The Matrix, and thinking about that sort of that 90s period, I mean, we had Rumble in the Bronx in the mid 90s, and it was almost like when that was released here in the States, it was almost like it was like a novelty, as opposed to like no, this guy, is doing something special. It was almost like this novelty. Oh, he does his own stunts and he almost gets hurt and all that stuff. But like you said, like, we get into the Rush Hour thing in '98. So 1 year after this film, after Drive. And yeah, I think there was a sense that, like, when they made these movies, I think all of the ones he kind of makes in the late '90s into the early 2000s, they're they have some of the Jackie Chan that you expect, but it's not like that same Hong Kong feel. It's almost like they try to sort of merge Hong Kong with an American sensibility, or sort of a Hollywood sensibility. And he has a bunch of hits there, but it's almost like it's only like I guess would have been Jackie Chan and Jet Li that were kind of the big ones for those kinds of movies, that maybe they thought too, like, okay, well, they have the cachet of being from China, from Hong Kong, whereas Mark Dacascos is from Hawaii, so it's like, what do we do with him? Because he's technically an American who's doing these kinds of movies. Maybe the same thing with Cynthia Rothrock. She's an American. That's not what American audiences want for the kung fu movie. They want somebody who's from Hong Kong.
Yeah, I mean, that could have been a factor as well. It's I think one thing with the Jackie Chan films is that he came from doing these fight scenes where they would spend months at a time just on the fight scenes, and then all of a sudden he's doing this film where maybe they'll say to him, right, you've got 1 week to do your fight scenes. So he found that quite difficult, and then he found it quite difficult working in a system where they would want to film everything in slightly longer takes on maybe a couple of cameras, whereas in Hong Kong they segment everything, so they'll shoot 4 seconds and then the next part they'll shoot another 4 seconds, and they'll do everything kind of almost chronologically, and then piece it together in the edit. So he probably found that process quite difficult. I mean, because the Hollywood ways, it's more time efficient, but it's not necessarily going to come together as smoothly and as organically as maybe doing it piece by piece.
Yeah, and there wasn't the sense too of even like having the separate action director that Hong Kong uses. I know PM Entertainment did that. They would have an action director for their scenes, and it shows for the budget that they have. I mean, you think of around the time this comes out, you have Recoil with Gary Daniels, which was just probably my favorite PM Entertainment movie. When they had Spiro Rosatos, I think it's Rosato, who was the action director on that one. But yeah, these movies didn't always, they didn't do the Hong Kong model of having the action director doing the action scenes and then the other director doing the more theatrical scenes.
Yeah, so I think it took a while for Jackie Chan to sort of adapt to that. And I know by Rush Hour 2, Brett Ratner basically gave him a bit more control over the actual action itself. Rather than using Chan as sort of an advisor, he gave him a little bit more creative control in as much as he could in the time that they had to, take control of the action scenes. Because he'll know better than anyone, how to place a camera in a way that makes it look even better.
Yeah, and that's something I think I've seen on Scott Adkins's podcast, his YouTube series where he's talking to other action stars, where they talk about being in these movies where you get a director who doesn't really know what they're doing. And I know, like, Michael Jai White had talked about that, where it's like he has to tell the director to shoot it a certain way because he knows when it comes to me or somebody, any of us, like, reviewing these movies, that if it doesn't look right, we're going to be like, oh, this was a bad movie for this for this star, and that he wants the movie to represent him in a certain way. And it's something I'd never really considered before when I watch a movie and I'm like, oh, they wasted Atkins, or they wasted Michael Jai White or something like that. That the reason why was because they had a director who really didn't know how to shoot action, but they just wanted to get the film out there and kind of do the best they could.
Yeah, very much so. I think there's a lot of action directors that kind of have the best of both worlds, really. I mean, Isaac Florentine obviously knows what he's doing. Jesse Johnson, to an extent, he knows action in terms of, putting together set pieces with guns and things like that and stunts. But I think after doing like one or two with Adkins, they kind of came to an understanding that maybe they would get, you know, a separate person in to do like the second unit in terms of the fights, and you know, kind of leave them to it. Guy called Tim Mann for a couple of films, I think, and then a couple of other choreographers that they've used as well. So, you know, sometimes a director can have an ego about it, or, you know, feel like they're being challenged and kind of rebel against that. But other times, like Jesse Johnson, for example, they'll do what's the best for the film. In terms of something like Triple Threat, where that needed to have slightly more Hong Kong style action, so he basically, you know, he just said, right, we'll give it to the choreographer and the second unit guy to, you know, take care of that side of it, and I'll take care of all the other bits with the, you know, explosions and guns and the drama.
Yeah, and when I think of Triple Threat, the thing for me that I always had trouble with is they had too many stars, and it was like they couldn't use them all. And
Yeah,
in a way, you think of it like, well, it's a good problem to have, but it was almost like, you know, there's so much. There was almost like I usually don't want a movie to be longer, but it's almost like that one could have used another half hour to it. And I think that's one of the things that's too bad. I think in a lot of cases is that, you know, again, Jesse B. Johnson doesn't have the budget to make anything more than a 90-minute film. The distributors don't want anything longer than a 90-minute film. So he's got like 6 of like the best, you know, I mean, if you put Michael Bisping in that category, I think you had, you know, the other 5 stars in that, some of the best action, you know, martial artists in movies, and there wasn't enough room for them all. It felt like, and I think that's part of the problem. I think is that that there isn't a sense of like these movies working the way that I think we would want them to work. It's almost like a fact where they maybe it's distributors who don't trust that we would watch the movie the way that we would want it to be made. I guess if that makes sense.
yeah. I think, you know, occasionally they're. I mean, obviously they put so much money into the films that they're going to be naturally cautious. And I think what it is sometimes that they just don't want to take that gamble to maybe give a film an extra 10 minutes, for fear of kind of losing the audience. I mean, particularly now when you've got to start thinking about your, you know, on streaming and advertising revenue. So, you know, you want your action film to have a certain amount of beats every sort of 5-10 minutes. You need some action because you want people to be staying until the end, and you want that extra bit of revenue from the film. So that's almost cemented the whole 90-minute thing even more now, I think, because advertising video on demand is quite big, really, in the low budget sort of film realm.
Yeah, that's an interesting point too, because I was thinking about like the Bruce Willis movies that, you know, some of them do kind of stretch into that hour 45, but even the 90-minute ones, because they have to mitigate the fact that Bruce Willis can't be in the film that for that much. And I think from a budgetary standpoint, they can't do as much in the action realm. There's just so much padding in those movies. And, you
Yeah,
know, if you get 20 minutes without an action sequence, it can be difficult to sort of make it through the film. So, you know, I definitely get that. You know, I think of, you know, this movie is a really great example. Recoil, which came out, I think, I don't know if it came out the same year or the year before, for PM Entertainment, but a similar one where it's like you start the film off with a really fantastic action sequence. And this one, there was a little bit of a buildup, whereas I think Recoil, it's just like suddenly there they are at the, you know, Daniels just shows up at this bank robbery, and it turns into this huge shootout, which leads to a dirt bike chase as well. Again, another, you know, it's like, you know, the baddies just happen to have a dirt bike nearby, and they just, you know, escape on it. But this one, you know, same thing where it's like, okay, we get into the scene, and it's like it's back to back really. It's like he fights on the boat, he escapes through the water, he shows up at this bar, he meets Kadeem Hardison, and immediately the baddies are there again at this bar, and we get another sequence, you know, not long after. And so you don't really have a lot of time to relax, which I think is good for a movie like this, that it's going to keep it going. But like you said, I think from a budget standpoint, if you've got to maintain, you know, every 10 to 15 minutes, those action sequences cost a lot more than just having 2 people sitting in a limo talking. And yeah, to be able to keep that budget up can be difficult if it's more than a 90-minute movie.
Yeah, definitely. I think, for the most part, a lot of these films tend to be the way they're made, they tend to be lighter than what they should be. So yeah, there is more padding out. But I think, as we were saying with something like Triple Threat, that felt like there was a lot that was condensed into it. Um, and that maybe it could have done with being just eased out slightly to add just to make, the plot a bit clearer and just to give a little bit more for each kind of individual star to do.
Yeah, because you think about like had Tony Jaa in that, Tiger Chen, Iko Weiss, where like they're having these very small little pieces here or there where they're interacting with each other. And then yeah, Michael Jai White and Scott Adkins, kind of the same thing. I mean, Scott Adkins' character, they kind of just introduce him as this like terrorist baddie character, and then Michael Jai White is sort of like his right hand man. And yeah, they get scenes where they're kind of you get a sense of who they are, but and I think also too for who these actors were, like you want them all to have. I mean, I think the fight scene with Weiss and Michael Jai White, for example, was a really great one. The way that they did that one, and you're anticipating that, and you're almost like, boy, it would have been nice to have something maybe like in between those that like could have built me up to that really great fight, like another one, 10 minutes before or something like that. That yeah, it was like you just didn't get enough of all of them because there was just too many in the film, and I guess, and I don't know, it feels like it would be a good problem to have, but I guess in that case it wasn't.
Yeah, yeah, and I guess that part of it is how long you've got them scheduled in for. So you have to really make the most of your time, and sometimes it can be quite a difficult job to get everything done within the schedule of a certain actor. Um, so yeah, they're just sort of cramming it in and just getting as much as they can from each individual actor.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, I guess that's one thing about Drive that does make Drive work in that sense, that it is just the Cascos, and then like you talk about the Alpha stunt team, they're kind of just there, sort of around him, as the baddies, that just sort of are there in those fight scenes, and so you just get just the Cascos the whole time, and I know they had the sort of the sort of upgraded model that he fights at the end. And I think that was a really great fight between those two when that happens. But it was almost too like, I think from a character development standpoint, that character just sort of shows up. It would have almost been nice if that character had some scene or something with other characters before that. Maybe he beats up police officers or something, just to kind of see what he can do before, to kind of build that up a little bit more, because that was an anticipated fight scene, but we really didn't know much about that other character.
No, I guess that's the time constraint. I know he's got the one introduction scene where he throws a coin
Right.
and
Yeah.
it goes right through this guy and then out the other side and it kind of sticks into the wall. But yeah, it's kind of very much like, well, he's our bad guy and he's going to come in right at the end for the final fight. So I mean, it's got those kind of cheesy action elements, but I think just from start to finish, it's really well paced, and I think it works so well because between the fights, you're kind of having fun as well. Um, I like the dynamic between Dacascos and Kadeem Hardison, but I also like the dynamic between the two villains, John Piper Ferguson and Tracy Walter. So they're kind of almost oddly likable, even though they do kind of like horrible things like most villains do. Um, there's just a kind of an interesting comedy dynamic between them two that they make quite a funny double act.
Yeah, and I like too. I mean, John Piper Ferguson's character is just sort of like the ugly American, as the baddie, and he starts off being like really arrogant about the whole thing and thinks this is going to be a piece of cake. We'll take it, And then as the film goes on, he realizes this isn't going to be so easy to do. And at the same time, he's talking to James Shigata, or Shigeta, who plays the company head in China, who wants to retrieve him, and he's getting like more and more testy with him, and getting more and more angry with him. And yeah, it is kind of a fun dynamic as they're sort of riding in this RV, and kind of going from place to place to to confront Dacascos. And we find out, of course, that Dacascos has a tracking device in his system, and that's how they're able to find him in all of these places. But the tracking device, of course, leads to a really great dynamic in the sense, like you talk about with the pacing, that we don't have to worry about how the baddies are going to find Dacascos and create another fight scene again. Like they already know where he's going to be, and they just show up and it happens. But yeah, those interplays were great. I think Kadeem Hardison is somebody that, as an actor, I think, like you said, he could handle the scenes that were not the action scenes and be funny and engaging, so that we could kind of take a break between those nice fight scenes.
Yeah, I think it's just they kind of take the easy option in terms of the plot, where they keep it very, very simple. So they're not having to, like you say, waste time. Where how are they going to find out where they are? It's just the tracking device is kind of like a useful technique, and maybe it's a little bit lazy in some ways, but I think the film is more preoccupied with being kind of like an all-out entertaining, fight fest. So they don't necessarily need to be too complex with their storyline. They just need to get it from A to B to C and then up to the end.
Yeah, and I've always appreciated that about a movie. One of the things I always talk about with action movies is not letting the plot get in the way, and this movie definitely doesn't do that. It like you said, it's well paced, and like the plot is there and the plot is important, but it never weighs the film down in a way that it detracts from the action, which is the sort of the centerpiece of it. And of course that action is just so fantastic with Mark Dacascos, that like the whole film really works in that sense.
Yeah, I think I think there's something to be said for doing something simple but doing it very well. I mean, even if you look at Top Gun Maverick recently, it's very kind of simple in terms of its storyline. They don't overcomplicate things, and they keep it quite vague in terms of who they're going up against and what they're doing. But it's about this collection of set pieces, and it's really well made. So I think doing something simple and doing it well is a good way to go.
Yeah, and I think that's an issue, it seems like, nowadays with movies. Like, obviously, the with what goes to the theater, it's always like, how big can it be, and how many people can be attracted to the film, and can it make clear $1 billion worldwide. But it seems like even with the direct-to-video realm, that even when they're trying to keep the movie within that 90-minute frame, that there's these moments where they kind of get carried away, or they do something. They either tack something onto the film that they didn't need to tack on, or they embellish something they don't need to embellish. And I think obviously it helps when you have something like Dacascos that you can lean on. But to that same point, it's like you almost feel like, well, why don't more movies lean on Mark Dacascos doing really fantastic action, and keep the movie simple in that sense, but have multiple outstanding fight scenes that you can really hang your hat on, versus trying to come up with as many cute plot twists as you can, or that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think sometimes it's difficult, because I think sometimes with these films that they overcomplicate it. I mean, I remember that kind of era where Steven Seagal was doing sort of 2 or 3 films a year, and there would always be some kind of like CIA subplot that kind of didn't particularly go anywhere, or really slowed the film down even more than it already was. And yeah, even like looking at the Marvel films, they have to cram so much in, and they have to have so many different sort of plot strands going kind of simultaneously. It can be quite difficult, to follow sometimes. But obviously, they kind of make up for that with the sheer scale of the spectacle. But if you've got a DTV film where there's not been a great deal of money spent on the action, and you're kind of grinding the film to a halt because you've got this subplot all of a sudden, it can be difficult to kind of keep your audience engaged. Whereas I think sometimes you just want meat and potatoes, quite simple, and just get yourself from A to B in the quickest route possible, and nail your action, and maybe nail your comedy as well.
Yeah, because I think this movie had the potential to have some of those faults with it, right? Like because, for example, with
Yeah,
Brittany Murphy's character, they leave her at the diner after they escape the motel when John Piper Ferguson blows it up with the rocket launcher. Um, they leave her there and say, we're going to, it's not safe for you to join us. We're gonna, keep you here. And so then it's like one less element that we have to worry about when we get to that final fight. And then also the final fight reminded me a lot of the Marvel movies where we have that moment where it's like the all hope is lost, right? Where Kadeem Hardison, his character is being strangled by John Piper Ferguson, and then Mark Dacascos is losing to the enhanced model from China that's coming to fight him. And every Marvel movie has that sense, right? That whole all hope is lost piece where it looks like the baddies are all going to win and everybody's going to lose, and then somehow they turn it around. And this did
yeah,
it so quickly, like that they turn it around happens fast enough that it doesn't weigh the film down, even though it's something we know is probably going to happen, that they have to add some level of intrigue that Mark Dacascos is having trouble beating this baddie. They do it so quickly that it doesn't weigh the film down. It doesn't feel as contrived as a lot of times in the Marvel movies it does, where it's like I feel like I have to go through this part of the film to get through the rest of the movie for the Marvel movies.
yeah. That's it. They're really, it's really kind of efficiently made in that sense of because it's coming in the middle of you just had this big set piece. There's been motorbikes and lots of fighting, weapons work and things like that. So for that last final stage of the fighting, you kind of want to get back into it before the audience kind of you don't want their adrenaline to come down too much. So you want to kind of get them back up again quite quickly.
Yeah, and it didn't do that, right? Because I mean, you get this baddie who shows up and he's throwing his sunglasses around, and he's got this big coat on, but he's just like sort of this next level. And it's the first time we see someone who's Dacascos' equal in the movie, so we want to see this fight happen as much as possible. But then, like you said, we also don't want it to be. I mean, I think of what was it, the second of the two Kickboxer reboot movies, where like the end fight scene I think went for a half hour with Alain Moussi and that kind of the big guy that he was fighting against. I want to say it was like a half hour film of that fight. So this they wanted to keep the pacing up and know that like yes, this is the big kind of denouement, but we don't want it to take too much out of the film watcher who's been with us for this point to this point.
Yeah, I think they really nailed the pacing on this. It was just yeah, really really well made, and you don't get overly exhausted by the fight scenes either. They just had that perfect balance of where they get to a point where there could be a danger of them dragging on too long. Because I mean, some set pieces, and you'll find this particularly in massive budget movies where if you've got 20-minute set pieces, they get exhausting after a time, and you just sort of almost want it to kind of move on to a dialogue scene. You just give me some dialogue, please. Um, I found that you find that a lot in the Marvel films, but I think that almost harkened back to Lord of the Rings. With like 30, 40-minute battle scenes in the two towers and things like that, where it's impressive, but it's too long.
Yeah, because you almost think of it too, like with because I always compare the action movie to the musical, and that like with a musical you need to have a musical set piece or dance piece or something every whatever 10 to 15 minutes, the way you need a fight scene every 10 to 15 minutes, and it can kind of be the same thing, that if it's like Gene Kelly is just if that scene is going on for too long, or Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, the scene is going on for too long, the audience gets tired of it and they want to kind of move on to the next thing. It's with action, it can kind of, like you said, it can be the same thing, because you can only do so much of the blocking, the kicking, the punching, and all that kind of thing back and forth. Even with this, where they're doing inspired things, like where it's like, okay, he's got to protect Brittany Murphy, so he's got to like kind of bounce her around off the bed and things like that to get her to dodge the bullets. Or Kadeem Hardison, where he's handcuffed to him with this sort of longer strand between their two cuffs, almost kind of like defiant ones or something. And he's doing these fight scenes with him where he's got to kind of flip him around and move him around to fight the bad guys. it's like it's really inspired and it's really cool, but like you said, it can sort of run into that uh, sort of excitement by repetition problem where you start to feel like, okay, I've already seen this before. And that is one thing that this film is very conscious of, is it never gets repetitive on us. That like each fight scene or every action bit, it belongs in the movie, but also it feels inspired. It feels like they wanted to do something different with each scene.
Yeah, yeah, most definitely. I think, there's a nice mix with, the vehicle stuff as well. That kind of brings an extra element in. All the different settings have their own kind of unique qualities as well. And obviously, like we said before, they bring the setting into it as well. Um, in the garage, he's kicking tires at people and things like that. So it's just really impressive the way they put together this film on such a small budget. And I'm glad it's become, really a sort of cult film, particularly among martial art fans. But it's just a shame that it didn't really kind of kick off bigger, on its release.
Yeah, because when you think of the '90s action movie, there's so many kind of these bigger budget films, and we think of especially the early half of that decade where you had Seagal, you had Schwarzenegger, you had Van Damme, putting out these classics, things like Hard Target, Mark for Death, all of those kinds of things. But this is one of the few, I think, from the later part of the decade that could sort of take the Pepsi challenge, so to speak, with those earlier '90s movies. It doesn't have the kind of the budget that those other movies had, yet still has the quality there that you could put this in a night where you're watching something like a Hard Target, or a Mark for Death, and it wouldn't feel out of place. It would feel like it can hold its own with those movies.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, if you look at some, like Seagal's earlier films and, Van Damme up to sort of a point as well, they both had their kind of individual things where they very much had their style of action and their kind of film. And I think, Drive in theory could have been the kind of thing that DeCascos could have been known for. So this could have been his thing, to do this kind of blend of Hong Kong style action, but in the Western audiences.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it may have, if filmmaker, or if the movie houses in America and Hollywood had been more creative, DeCascos may have worked better than Jackie Chan in that sense, because he does come from both traditions, right? Like he grew up in Hawaii, he grew up in America, so he knows the Hollywood tradition of films, but then also with his martial arts background, with his parents and sort of studying martial arts, he also knows the Hong Kong tradition of making movies. And he might have been a better bridge than, like you said, with Jackie Chan, where he's like, why are they making movies like this over here? Or why aren't they shooting this the way that it should be shot? He could have bridged the gap better. And I think Double Dragon maybe is an example of that, where he could have potentially, had it been better made, I think it would have shown that he could do that kind of part.
Yeah, I mean, if they'd have been a bit more consistent with the comedy and that, and maybe brought the kind of style of fighting that they had in Drive,
Yeah.
I mean, that could have been a better way to do that film and have it, become more popular.
Yeah, and you bring up a great point in terms of the comedy aspect, that Kadeem Hardison is a comedic actor, whereas Scott Wolf wasn't. He was more of a dramatic actor who could do offbeat things, but he wasn't like the level of Kadeem Hardison. He essentially, the sitcom A Different World here in the U.S., that sort of spin off from the Cosby Show. He really carried that show, especially it was meant to be a vehicle for Lisa Bonet, but she leaves soon after, and it's really Kadeem Hardison, and then Jasmine Guy was the co-star with him. But it really was about what was his character Dwayne Wayne. What was he doing in that episode with his flipped up glasses and his sort of offbeat style. And so yeah, he's definitely, and he's probably another one too. I think he probably got typecast with the Different World and didn't get the roles he should have. So it's sort of another situation here where someone who is not getting the roles that he should have, who's probably better than the material, or better than the roles he's getting. It's almost like a sort of an embarrassment of riches that they, for a movie like this, they get someone as skilled as DeCascos and someone as skilled as Hardison to play these parts in a lower budget film.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And I think also, if you look at Brittany Murphy, she was sort of in that transitional period as well. just before she was kind of becoming consistently cast in these bigger productions. So I think, you know, there's a really great cast in it, and they gel really well. I think sometimes you can have a good cast, but you know, the different elements don't really gel together that well. But in this one, they really did, which I think really carries a lot of the film through as well, particularly in the sort of the non-action parts.
Yeah, and I think again, I think that's that issue we talked about where like Brittany Murphy is not your traditional like female lead in a movie like this. And so when she comes in this offbeat role, I mean, one of the things I thought about this film is it feels like it could have been a blood fist movie. You know, it had like the plot that you could have seen Don the Dragon Wilson in this part, and you know, sort of the way it worked out. But again, it, you know, between the fact that the action sequences were even better than a lot of the ones that Wilson did in those movies, the fact that you have a character, you know, you have Kadeem Hardison and a Brittany Murphy, you know, again, you wouldn't have seen a Brittany Murphy character in a Blood Fist movie. You know, it would have been a much more straight ahead. You know, I think Jillian McWhorter was one who's in a lot of those movies. You know, just sort of a traditional romantic lead for him, that he can have his love scene with her, and maybe she could be a damsel in distress. I mean, that's another piece about this film. We have no damsel in distress. There's none of that sort of piece that he has to go save or rescue anybody. Brittany Murphy's character, she's there to be like sort of a quirky, sort of fun element to get us from point A to point B. And she does a really fantastic job with that. But she's not anywhere like the traditional lead, a female lead would be in an action movie like this. And I think it made it hard maybe to market or for people to understand it when they were, you know, thinking about distributing it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's you know, it's an interesting, you know, part about her character, that she's really kind of, she's a little bit crazy as well. So I think, you know, she doesn't have that same sense of fear that, like you say, you get with a damsel in distress. So
Right.
she gets a little bit sort of crazy, and she's almost ready to sort of take a gun and start firing back at them.
Right, right. Yeah, she's it's like Kadeem Hardison has to stop her from just kind of getting out there and shooting, because she's like leaving herself like vulnerable to getting shot. But you're right, like she's just so excited for it. And then at the same time, I mean, I think also too, a lot of times with these characters, like, you know, they tell her at the diner, okay, you need to stay here. You know, we'll come back and see you at some point, but you need to stay here because it's not safe for you. You know, usually that character will do something like, you know, stow away in the trunk of a car, right? And then get themselves into trouble and become again like a hostage or something, or damsel in distress for the baddies to catch them. But no, none of that happens with her. She, you know, it's a very unique kind of role. And I think it maybe kind of, you know, speaks to how this film was made, and a lot of the decisions that they made.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's, you know, they've managed to make something that kind of defies expectations in a lot of ways. You know, you got a hero that's a little bit different. Maybe, you know, Kadeem Hardison's kind of like the more generic character in it. And then you've got Brittany Murphy, who's very sort of quirky. And you've got, you know, a pair of quirky villains as well.
Yeah, it's a very offbeat thing that it doesn't fit the paradigm of what everybody wants I guess what they think an action movie should be, which, to be honest, I think for us that watch a lot of action movies, a lot of, yeah, you know, we like the straight ahead thing, but like you said, the meat and potatoes is sort of the most important part, and the movie definitely does that, right? It gives us exactly what we want out of an action movie. So then these other sort of more inspired pieces that they add to the film, you know, we're okay with them taking that chance with it, because the rest of the movie works. So it's, you know, for Brittany Murphy to be a more offbeat character, for them not to use the damsel in distress trope and all of that, it works better because everything else is working, I think.
Yeah, that's it. I think, you know, it'd be, sometimes you can have quirky characters in films where it just feels like it's really out of place. So, you know, each element seems to tie together really well in this one.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's, I think, you know, the obviously the action is the number one thing about this movie. It's the sort of the centerpiece of what makes the whole thing work. And I think none of the rest of it would work if it wasn't for Mark Dacascos and, you know, the Alpha Stunt team, and the really fantastic action sequences they have, and the really great, you know, well choreographed fight scenes that are just well shot and look really good. So, without that, this movie doesn't work. But then it's sort of like all the other pieces kind of come into play to make it something really, truly special.
Yeah, yeah, most definitely.
Well, yeah. So we're about to maybe wrap up, and we can maybe do some plugs here. But was there anything else about this film that you wanted to mention, Tom?
I think it's just one of those films that, from as soon as I discovered it, just watching it on satellite TV, it just it grabbed me right from the first kind of watch, and then I was kind of looking through it in the TV listings to see when it came on again, so I could show my brother. And then then I bought the VHS. A little bit later, I bought the DVD. Um, it's just one of those, you can sometimes there's films where you have to sort of get yourself ready to watch it, to really invest in it and get yourself in the right frame space to watch it. But this is one of those which is just really easy to kind of put on and watch again.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it's, when we were talking about, because, the last time you were on, we were talking about what the topic might be for the next time you came on, and you mentioned DeCascos, and I was thinking about like how we would, do an episode, and I thought, what, Drive would probably have enough material for an entire episode on its own, that we probably wouldn't need to add a second film to it. And it really is one of those special movies that just has so many great pieces to it that you can almost talk about it for hours, that there's so many great things in there. And like you said, you don't have to prepare yourself to watch it, because it's just like the moment you turn it on, it again, it just sort of grabs you right away. And for me, it had been some years since I'd last seen it, and it was still immediate, that it was just like, there's DeCascos on the boat, he jumps down in the middle of these bad guys and just starts getting after it. And yeah, it's just a really fantastic movie. It's one that people haven't seen it. It's definitely, you probably, as soon as you finish listening to this, you've got to go fire it up.
Yeah, 100%. It still holds up really well. It's just a really really easy film to watch. So fans of guys like Scott Adkins, who expect a certain level of quality within the fight scenes, I think they'll get a lot out of this as well. And they'll probably appreciate the comedy as well, and just the simplicity of it.
Yeah, because maybe a good comp for this is in 2019, where we had Avengement come out, and it was one of those ones that, like, direct to video film that people watched and were like, wow, this is like better than a lot of what we're seeing in the theater. It's just, it's one of the best action movies we've seen in a long time. Drive is almost kind of the same thing for the late 90s. It's not the same movie in the sense that, like, it's like you said, it's much more offbeat, much quirkier. It's not as dark as Avengement was. But from an action standpoint, I think the fight scenes in Drive are a little bit better in the sense that they're the martial arts, kind of the whole team together is really great in it. But Avengement also just has some really great action sequences, especially in the prison there. But I think that's almost a good comp, that for people that were really big on Avengement but haven't seen Drive yet, I think they would really appreciate this.
Yeah, definitely. And I think also maybe fans of things like Debt Collectors would probably enjoy it as well. That, because you got that kind of the buddy element as well. So yeah, I think martial art fans and fans of a good old fashioned buddy cop kind of buddy film would really like this as well.
Yeah, for sure. And I think for me, I have it on DVD just because one of the followers of the blog back in 2010. He wanted me to review it, so he just sent me his DVD copy of it. But mine is like from that long ago. I think there's a newer version of it out now, isn't there?
Yeah, I mean, I know in the UK through 88 Films they've got a release now. So there's there's a 4K version now which has the director's cut and a load of features and things that have been on previous editions, and a Blu-ray as well. So I've got my director's cut collector's edition DVD here, but I'm probably due to replace it with the Blu-ray soon.
Yeah, I don't know if they're available, because so one of the problems is for Amazon is that they confuse it with the uh, Ryan Gosling Drive, which I was a film that I also really enjoyed, but it's a completely different movie from this one. So
Yeah,
yeah, for American, especially if you're looking on Amazon, that can be a little bit difficult. That you're gonna have to sift through the you have to sift through the yeah, and I think that's part of the reason why it wasn't it didn't have the right information on in terms of like because it looks like, yeah, it's available free on all these other sites to stream, but it didn't show that in the IMDb because it was pulling up the information on the Ryan Gosling movie. So yeah, that's another issue probably that you run into as you're looking for a good version of this. But it's for people that collect physical media, this is definitely one to have in your collection.
Yeah, definitely. And I'll also say, if anyone gets a chance to listen to the DVD commentary, that's a lot of fun too. So they got the director, the head of Alpha Stunts, Dacascos and Kadeem Hardison on commentary, and they're just having a whale of a time in it. So that's a lot of fun in itself.
Yeah, I would be excited to check that out because I think it's one of the things for me. If the movie itself is really good, I don't mind watching it again with the commentary. It's almost like, I want to see this movie again anyway. I remember when my friends and I, when we watched Black Dynamite the first time, we immediately watched it again with the commentary because we enjoyed it so much. And I think this is one of those movies that you could watch without the commentary and watch again, soon after with the commentary, and because it's just so great that it's such an exciting movie.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's, action fans will eat it up. If they've not seen it already, they'll just really go for it.
Yeah, and I would almost say too, because for me it had been some time since I had seen it. So obviously I watched it for our podcast episode. I would say for people out there who haven't seen this in some time, watch it again because it doesn't disappoint. I think if you're if you're looking through streaming services on a Saturday night and you see like a bunch of Bruce Willis movies or something like that, or newer Seagal movies or something, you're like, oh, maybe I'll watch one of those, because you hadn't seen it before. Consider just rewatching Drive. I think you might find you have a more fun evening doing that.
Yeah, I think that would be a safe bet. Yeah.
Sure. Well, yeah, maybe that's a good place to leave it. So then, Tom, was there anything that you wanted to plug while we're wrapping up?
Uh, Not at the moment. I think I've got one film coming out at the beginning of November, I believe, in the US, which is called the Area 51 Incident. So that's a bit of a sci-fi action, kind of in the vein of Aliens, but without the budget. And yeah, just anyone who hasn't checked out When Darkness Falls yet, that is, as we said earlier, that's on Peacock now, Tubi, Amazon. I think it's on Vudu as well and Hoopla, and yeah, possibly Roku as well.
Yeah, and it's funny. So Area 51 incident. Oh, it does list it. Okay, so it didn't when I was looking up your profile on IMDb, it didn't seem like it came up there under your writing credits. But then when I looked it up on IMDb, it listed you as one of the writers. But yeah, I guess because it's coming out November 1st, so maybe that was why, because it didn't have that there. But yeah, I think it seems like a lot of your of the DTV movies that you write for, they end up on like Tubi or something like that you can find them through there.
Yeah, I think a lot of them do end up on Tubi. That's a big platform really for low budget independent films. So yeah, that's probably the major one, along with Amazon.
Yeah, and then I think early next year they're talking about potentially for Renegades coming out, which I think is definitely a highly anticipated one. The next one from Shogun Films.
Yep, so yeah, there should be an announcement soon for the US release, and then UK release will be January. I think end of January next year.
Yeah, so that one's going to be like I guess the reverse of what When Darkness Falls, where When Darkness Falls was released in the US first, and then does it have a UK release yet, or is it still just the US?
So When Darkness Falls, we're still looking for a UK distributor at the moment. So that's probably going to be sorted out after AFM. So we're sort of taking the film to sales shortly. So hopefully by the end of the year, we'll have a few more territories tied up.
Okay. Right. Well, so at least for US based audiences, definitely you can stream When Darkness Falls. You can also buy you can buy physical media for it. I think it's available on Amazon and DVD as well.
Yeah, available on Amazon, and I believe it's region free as well. So you can actually buy it from the UK, via the US. So you can kind of import it in, and I think a few UK platforms have kind of already got copies in that they can. So you don't have to sort of wait 3 weeks for it to arrive.
Yeah, and I think When Darkness Falls, as we're wrapping up here, I think it's a movie that everybody should check out. I really enjoyed it, and I think the thing I really like about When Darkness Falls, I mean, it's very different, obviously, from the movie we were just talking about with Drive, where When Darkness Falls is more of a slow burn. But I think it's a really fantastic sort of slow burning thriller that it kind of builds on itself in a really organic way. But also, I think the combination of the way the story unfolds, the way that the characters are developed, but also the way that the setting, the Scottish Highlands, are used as almost like another character in the film, just really adds a depth to it that, as we were talking about earlier, with this attempt to want to wash out the film and make it all one color. This film doesn't do that, and it really adds an element to it that I think I really enjoyed.
Yeah, well, thank you. That's good to hear. I think we wanted to give it a sense of like 3 dimensions, really, and I think you can do that with plenty of color in your film and just accentuating the depth of the countryside, really.
Yeah. So that's definitely one people, so definitely here in the States, and probably keep us posted, because we'll probably be able to update you on the site, like when Darkness Falls is available in other markets, but at least for right now, that one's in the US. And so definitely everybody should check that out. Like you said, it's on Tubi now. I know it's on Peacock. I think usually when it's on Tubi, it seems like most of the streamers pick it up here in the States.
Yeah, that seems to be the way. Yeah, I think we're on most of the sort of the major ones now. Anyway, I think we're on the ones that we kind of the ones we really want.
Yeah, and I think, like I said, when I started typing in When Darkness Falls in IMDb, I got midway through dark. I got the D and the A when it auto-filled for me and popped up, which I think is really fantastic. Because I think there are some other movies that have a similar title, but the fact that it's going to pop up on IMDb definitely shows that it's sort of hopefully building some momentum. And I think anybody listening, check out Drive, of course, but also check out When Darkness Falls. You could do a double feature on Tubi, for example, because Drive is on Tubi as well.
Yeah, that would make quite a double feature.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wonder which order. Yeah, because I wonder, because you might for Drive, your brain might be velocitized from how high octane Drive is. So it might be better to do them in reverse and do When Darkness Falls first if you're going to do double feature.
Yeah, that's the way I would do it as well.
Right. Well,
and it's a nice pick me up as well after a bit of a mystery thriller.
Right, exactly. Yeah, so it's a good double feature there, and again, they're both on Tubi. They're less than the length to combine. They're less than the length of Infinity War or the new Batman movie. So so you can get 2 for the price of 1 there as well. All right, excellent. Well, thank you again, Tom, for coming on again. The movie that he has out is When Darkness Falls. Also, look for Renegades next year, and then of course on Flickering Myth. Look for Tom's articles on there. But thank you again for coming on. This was a really great conversation about a fantastic movie.
Thanks a lot, Matt. I look forward to the next one.
All right, absolutely. And thank you everybody for listening. Talk to you soon. Bye.